Hi class, welcome to lecture 3, part A. Today we're going to be talking all about federalism. Let's go ahead and start with the definition of federalism. We're going to define it as a system of government in which power is divided between an overarching federal government and smaller regional governments. Federalism isn't unique to the United States, but our system is of course going to have intricacies that other systems may or may not have. So in the United States, we have our federal government, and then we have our regional governments, and our state governments. Okay, so federalism is defining the relationship between the state, federal, and local governments. It's not as if the federal government reigns completely supreme over all other governments. There is some autonomy at the state and local level. It's not completely controlled again by the federal government. So why do we have this somewhat weird, odd system? Because if you think about it, it is kind of odd, right? What laws do you follow? Which government do you listen to? And I think coronavirus is an excellent example of this, right? We're getting different information from different states and from the federal government. The reason we have this type of system is it's complex, right? Part of the reason is because power is actually given to both the federal and the state government in the Constitution. So if you look at the Constitution, you look at the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, it states that power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So essentially, unless the Constitution specifically gives the federal government a power, it's automatically reserved for the states. So by default, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, it goes to the states, okay? However, we do sometimes get laws that clash. So what does this mean? What happens? Well, there's something called preemption, which invalidates state law that conflicts with federal law. And we also have something called the supremacy clause and the elastic clause. So sorry for skipping ahead there. And we'll talk more about these later. Another reason we have a federal system, it was to simply diffuse power. So if we spread out government among many entities, federal, state, local, it makes it less likely that any such government could become tyrannical. So if the federal government became tyrannical, started infringing on our liberties, the idea is that state governments or even local militias or local governments, whatever it might be, can band together and overthrow that federal government. Another reason is simply the attitude of citizens during the time before and during the Revolutionary War. You have to remember, we were a loose number of colonies, right? 13 colonies. We really thought of ourselves as colonies or states, not as a united nation. So when we came together with the Constitution and created the United States of America, it's just that United States. So people wanted to preserve that sort of autonomy and localized government they had before the Revolutionary War. And when they created the first attempt at a more national government with the Articles of Confederation, this is clearly reflected, right? If you remember from our last lecture, you'll note that the Articles of Confederation essentially gave all power to the states with a very weak federal government. So this was very reflective of the ideals of the people at the time. So when the Constitution is being created and ratified, so it's ratified in 1788, you have two camps. You get the Federalist and you get the Anti-Federalist. And there was a lot of tension, right? And that's part of the reason why the Constitution has the Bill of Rights, part of the reason why the Constitution is a compromised document. So the Federalists were proponents of a strong central government. They wanted the Constitution to be ratified. They wanted this more powerful central government. They looked at the problems with the Articles of Confederation and said, okay, we need to fix this. We need to create a stronger centralized government. And I have listed some presidents here who have taken more power to the federal government or created stronger federal systems. The Federalists emphasized the importance of the supremacy clause. So I mentioned we talk about that later, and we're going to talk about it now. Essentially, the supremacy clause states that federal law is the supreme law of the land. So again, going back, when there's a conflict between state and federal law, which there sometimes is, and we'll talk more about that later, the federal law wins out because it is the supreme law of the land. We would say Federalists today are more in camp with modern day Democrats. Democrats tend to support a stronger central government. The anti-federalists were the opposite. They did not want the ratification of the Constitution. They thought, at the very least, the states should be co-equal in power to the federal or national government. And they tend to focus, instead of on the Supremacy Clause, they tend to focus on the 10th Amendment, which we already discussed, which gives states more power, more rights. And they envisioned a country with very limited central government, more so what we saw under the Articles of Confederation. Today, we'd say they're more aligned with our current modern day Republicans, who tend to advocate more for states' rights. Although during the Trump administration, we did see some Republicans kind of switch their tune and support a stronger central government. And we did see some Democrats support states' rights to disobey the government. So, you know, these things go back and forth, but generally Republican ideals are anti-strong centralized government. The Anti-Federalists also wanted nullification power to belong to the states. And obviously this didn't happen, but when they were drafting the Constitution, they wanted nullification, meaning they thought that the states should have the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional. Okay, so can you imagine that today, if the federal Congress passed the law, the states got together and said, no, you know what, this is unconstitutional. Obviously, we don't have that system. The Supreme Court can do that, not the states, but that is something that they were advocating for. So going back to more generalized view of federalism, you normally see it in countries that are very large geographically and very broad and diverse. And I think the US is a perfect example of this. We're a very large country, and we're a very unique and different country. And the example I use here, I think, is a good one. Look at the northeast and the south, or look at the southwest and the south, right? We have very different states. Can you think of more different states than Texas and New York, right? They're very, very different. Or, you know, California and one of the southern states, Texas, Alabama, right? It's almost like a different country. What federalism allows us to do is coexist, create our own laws and rules for our states and our local governments, while still existing together under the broad spectrum of the federal government. That's one of the pluses of federalism. It allows very different regions and states to coexist under their own laws while still being loyal to a federal government. So again, going back to the United States of America, we very much are a band of United States under one large government with unique state governments. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of federalism today. It's very important that you know the difference between these types. There are more types of federalism. We're not going to go over all of them. There's about a dozen of them, but these are the ones that I want to cover in the class, starting with dual or layer cake federalism. Now, if you bake cakes, maybe you'll kind of give it away what a layer cake is, or if you eat layer cakes, maybe this will give it away. But essentially what dual federalism is when there's clear distinctions between the powers of the federal and state governments that very rarely overlap. And this is the type of system we really had in this country until the Great Depression. Now, if you look at a layer cake I have here, which kind of looks gross now I look at it with all the sprinkles, but imagine each layer of this cake represents a type of government. So on the top, you have the federal government, then you have below that, you have the state government, and then local governments. So in a dual federalist system, which again, we had in the United States until around the 1930s, you have clear distinctions between the state and federal government. There's not a lot of overlap. So the federal government has their responsibilities, the state government has their responsibilities, and they don't mix and blur. So for example, the state would handle education. The federal government would handle military, right? And they wouldn't overlap at all, okay? That is layer cake federalism. Of course, we do not have that today, and times began to change in that the federal government began to grow bigger. And that tends to happen in countries when there is crises. And obviously during the 30s and 40s, we had a lot of crises. In the 30s, we had the Great Depression. In the 40s, we had World War II. So in times of crisis, the federal government, and probably rightly so, tends to become bigger in the interest of the nation. Now, here's the thing about the federal government. When you give them power, when they take power, it's very unlikely you're going to give that back. The federal government is pretty much constantly seeking to grow. And these changes in the size of the federal government led to our next type of federalism, which is the one that we currently have today, called cooperative or marble cake federalism, another cake, and maybe you can see where this is going. So where dual federalism is the federal government's duties and responsibilities do not overlap at all with the states, cooperative federalism is when they do indeed overlap. The powers, duties, and responsibilities of the federal and state government are mixed and blurred. And this is the system we've had since the 30s and 40s. And it's one that can be beneficial, but also one that can lead to a lot of confusion and conflict because both the state and federal government are doing the same job, essentially. Let's take a look at a marble cake here. You can see, imagine the state government's the white part and the federal government's the black part. They're all mixed and blurred. It's hard to see where one begins and one ends. And this is really the system we have now. I mean, if you think about it, think about education. Used to be a state issue. Now it's a state and federal issue. The federal government has dipped its hand into it. Policing, right? We have a bunch of federal policing agencies. We have state policing agencies. We have local police agencies. Taxes, same thing. The government's responsibilities overlap between the state level and the federal level constantly. So again, bringing up concurrent powers, remember that these powers often belong to both the state and the federal government. That's essentially what concurrent powers are. But again, remember the supremacy clause. Remember that federal law is the supreme law of the land and can trump state law. Our last type of federalism we're going to talk about is called new federalism or devolution. This became popular in the 1980s with kind of Reagan economics. This is the idea that the federal government should become smaller, should give some of the powers it took from the states in the 30s and 40s back to the states. Goes in line with kind of the whole small government is good government. Let free market economics take control. Let the market dictate what we need and what we don't need. Okay. And there's 4 types of federalism. Our last type of federalism is called progressive federalism. This is the most recent type of federalism. We've seen it under both Bush and Obama. Essentially, this is progressive federalism with some tweaks. It allows for states to have greater control over issues that normally are handled by the national government, but it gives them flexibility in achieving these goals. So the federal government's still handling the issue, but it kind of is hands off. It says, as long as you get from A to B, we don't care, to the states, right? So federal supervision, but more autonomy to the states. That's how we would define progressive federalism. A couple examples from George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Some of you might remember this if you're the right age. You might be too young, depending on how old you are, but the No Child Left Behind program. Essentially, Bush instituted a federal mandate that there be national testing requirements for public schools, and funding was tied up in the results of these federal tests. So if you've taken a lot of federal tests, national testing in school, it's because of programs like this, okay? And the No Child Left Behind is very controversial, and I'll just say it's very unpopular because a lot of people critiqued it in saying that teachers began to teach for the test because they couldn't have students fail because they lose funding, right? Also, advanced students were getting held back by students who were struggling, et cetera. So an example of progressive federalism, but perhaps an example of a federalist program that failed. Barack Obama, a similar program, created Race to the Top, essentially national requirements for education, but it rewarded teaching plans and innovative teaching instead of just test results. Still though, the federal government inserting itself in a traditionally state-run area, education, would be an example of progressive federalism. Okay, so that's gonna wrap up lecture 3, section A. Please tune in for section B. I will post it right away.